Okay, so I just finished this animation and did it really quick. Took about like 5 days of work over 2 weeks, and I just wanted to go through some of the stuff I did because I kind of like used a lot of little tricks. Thought it would be worth documenting. So this is the first scene. So the little bird. Animated it super quick and dirty. The actual body model, this thing, is something I got from Model Resource. I just searched bird, found this like little low poly bird, just scaled it down on the Y, and put a little skeleton. That's super small, super easy. Just bones for the head, body, and the two wings. Guess we'll just move from the feet up. So this collar, just a simple cylinder that, I shelled. And for the spikes and the rings around the spikes, what I used was in the plugin hard ops, which is mostly for hard surface stuff. I don't do a lot of hard surface, but there's some little things in it that make things pretty easy. I'm really partial to, if you select this, circle, at every vertex you select, it creates a little circle. So I just did that, bumped those out, turned them into toruses and spikes with extrude and the skin modifier, which I also use a couple other places here. So if we move up, the head, the beak, the beret, that's all sculpted, and I can get into sculpting in a little bit. Nothing too technical. I'm not that good at sculpting, so just some quick and dirty stuff. I kind of do the method that a lot of people seem to use, which is adding a cube, taking that cube, subdividing it a couple times, and then on top of that adding a cast, setting this factor to 1 to get it perfectly spherical, or as close to perfectly spherical as possible, and then sculpting off of that. That's pretty boilerplate. I think there's also, if you have the plugin, or if you activate the plugin, extra objects or something. There's a round cube, which kind of gives you the same thing, but I don't know. You can make it rounder, but just doing the cast and whatever, it works for me. I'm not like trying to speed run Blender or anything. As you can tell, I'm pretty sloppy. I don't do the quickest stuff often. So yeah, there's nothing really that crazy about the way I sculpted this. Just I'm going to sculpt mode now. I'll kind of go over what I use. The snake hook tools are really useful for pulling stuff out. Often more useful than the grab tool. Otherwise, it's just like kind of sticking to these. It's the same stuff you'll see in like anyone else's tutorial, and they'll go more in depth. And just fucking around with it. That's really what you gotta do if you're gonna get into sculpting. Is just be prepared to like screw around, I think. That's kind of all that's really going on in the modeling phase with those. Objects. This is something, I really like the way this turned out. So we can, let's walk through this. So this is just a bunch of vertices, or a bunch of segments, with the skin modifier on, which, if you know anything about the skin modifier, it just kind of creates geometry around where you're putting your vertices. It's similar to like using a spline or using a curve, but I feel like there's like a little more control over this. It might not be as like elegant or parametric as like using a spline, but it's just like, it's often a lot simpler what I need. And it took me a while to really figure out how to use this modifier. You really have to be paying attention to, in the item tab, where is it? These mean radiuses. This controls the radius of like what you have selected. So that's kind of where I've set these ones in the middle to be, 0.009 and the ones on the edge is 0.002. And then with a subdivide on top of that, that gives it like a cleaner little rounded thing. And, you know, this is supposed to be kind of like a weird flat object that's just seen from like straight on. If I was doing like a more complicated thing, I'd put like a shrink wrap on top of this and have it like stick to the surface more, which I can get into later. Just keep moving up. So on the eyes, I have these parented to 2 empties, which with collections up here can be kind of redundant, but I just feel like being able to grab these in the world space is pretty helpful. The eyelids, I think I got these from like an Oni tutorial or stream or something, but it's just the geometry from the actual eyeball, which is just a subdivided rounded cube stretched around. The eyelids are that like split with a little bit of messing around with the vertices and a solidifier modifier on top of that to kind of make it stick out from the eye. And then the actual pupil, and this is something that I've used a couple times. I don't think it's like the most robust trick, but it's like pretty quick and dirty for cartoony eyes. You can add a shrink wrap modifier set to the eye with these settings, and then when you move it around, it kind of sticks, but you can see like once you get close to the edge, it breaks. But if you're just doing like kind of cartoony stuff like this, especially when it's only seen from like one direction, it works. It bears mentioning that like this is for a really specific, really short, dirty animation. There's like no way this would be like a good game asset or like useful in like a lot of situations. Moving up, you know, just a baggy cube that's been stretched with the sculpt mode. Just a cylinder. This is like a little shape. I think I just made it with, you know, a flat plane solidified around the edges, messing with the crease and bevel weight up here to make it kind of sharper with the subdivide. And then these are just from the text tool, turned into meshes and screwed around with. So that is all the modeling here. As far as animation goes, it's pretty simple. Everything's just like parented to this armature. The only real motions are the head moving, these going up and down, the eyelids, whether they're rendered or not is on keyframes. So there's no real blinking animation. These just like pop in, which is good enough for what I used, or for what I needed it to be used for. These are animated, just kind of moving on the X, but because they're shrink wrapped, there's like a roundedness to them. So now I guess the next thing to do is to get into the shading and materials for everything, because this is kind of where I put the most amount of work in. Pretty much to get stuff to look good, open up the shading tab, or shading workspace or whatever. It's good to have, just like right from the start, an HDRI. You can get them from HDRI Haven. You set it up like this. We can quickly go through here. This is like my cycle settings. Nothing's really that different. I guess I could have this selected. I don't know that it really makes a difference with how I have things set up. Everything else here is pretty much the same. This isn't I just used this folder or this file for working on this bird. There's no real like actual like render settings or anything dialed in. Nothing in the compositor. Nothing here was really meant to be rendered, but putting this HDRI in just like makes the textures or the materials look better. Alright, so let's like quickly walk through. So for the bird's body, you can kind of see this clay style look that most of these materials have isn't hard to pull off. Really all you need to do is like have your BSDF set up so that there's like some subsurface, a little bit of shininess, and that's kind of it. what I've done here is I'm using the texture that came with the bird model, set to a color ramp that's dialed in to kind of break it down between two shaders. And the reason I'm doing shaders and not like a mix RGB is just because there's base color and subsurface that are different for both. I could easily use a mix shader for that, or a mix RGB for that going into one shader, but whatever. It's all the same to me for this. So there's nothing else really that deep going on. There's a noise texture plugged into a displacement node, which is going into the displacement of the material output, and that's what's giving it this bumpy look. You could probably get away with doing just like a bump value on the normals, but since I'm rendering this stuff out in cycles, making it look as nice as possible, I have the displacement that I'm using. The only real difference materially, like there's a lot of differences going on in the background with math, I'm sure, but is that in cycles you can set your displacement in the settings to bump only or displacement and bump, which will start to f with the geometry. And that kind of gives you this like rougher thing. You could go further. I've seen people put like specular maps of little thumbprints on stuff, which makes it look like really cute and really clay-like, but I'm not really going for that. I don't really care that much for this project, but I just kind of wanted to show off how kind of easy this like really appealing clay style is to pull off in the materials. This is kind of what all my nodes look like, or all my materials look like. Another thing I did here that might look foreign is the Fresnel from the layer weight going into an RGB curve. I watched some tutorial that said like this is a good way of getting like Fresnel roughness for your principled BSDF. I don't know how much of a difference it makes, but it is a nice step. It's another level of control that you can have over your materials. And you can see you just take whatever normal value you would normally be plugging straight in, and you just multiply that by the curve from the Fresnel, which looks like that, then looks like that, then looks like that, then looks like that, then looks like that. And you can see you control like the sharpness here, which is kind of like how mirror-like it gets, which is a little different than just setting the overall roughness value to be lower or higher. You kind of have this nice curve to play with. And I normally keep it like either high up like this, so it's like kind of a softer reflection, or you can pull it down and get really sharp. Normally for like reflective metallic things, I'll have it down here. But this is just a force of habit. Like, I don't know how much visually it's really going to change by putting just like a regular value in here. I mean, I guess we can kind of see. But it is just like another level of control if you're really trying to like be really focused on your materials the way I kind of like to work. As we move around, you're going to see a lot of these are the same exact material with different color values. I think this, these, all the same. This is different. I usually leave the specular at 0.5 because I think that's like, I don't think it's like a thing you really have to mess with that much. But for eyes, if you want the reflection to be like pinpoint the way they are in like cartoony eyes, you can set the specular down really low and that'll do that. On the collar, the only other trick I did here is sometimes I like to do this with the ambient occlusion node. I did it here because of like this crease with the beak where that is. I wanted that to be more defined. So if you take the ambient occlusion, you can set it to only local if you don't want anything else to be taken into account. Doesn't really matter here. You can raise it to a power that'll give you kind of like a darker, the darker areas are darker, right? It doesn't really like grow that area at all the way it would with like a color ramp maybe, but it just makes them darker. Then it's going into a color ramp to really like crunch everything down. And then that's multiplied by this base color to just give more definition around the mouth. And it's going into the BSDF. It shares a material with the collar. Obviously the color isn't really that affected by the ambient occlusion, so it doesn't really matter. Here's a metallic shader for these little rings, little rivets. This is kind of how I set up metallics. You can see the Fresnel is pulled, the RGB curve on the Fresnel is pulled down to make it more shiny. I have some anisotropic up. This is something that can be fun to play with. I don't really have like an exact method for messing with this, but just play around with this slider, and the one below it can kind of give you a different look with your metallics. And then these share a material with this badge up here. I really like making materials like this. It's really fun. These spikes, obviously, if they had more geometry towards the end, it would probably be shading a little better, but it's not really important to me right now. The way this works is I have another ambient occlusion going into the power, going into the multiply, and that's multiplying by a color ramp, which is set to hue, saturation, value, and far. Both ends of the color ramp are the same color, so you get this like full spectrum in between. You can with that a little bit with the HSV node, multiply that into the color of your metallic BSDF, and then you can see where you're pointed at. It's kind of changing the direction of that color ramp, and it's just like a really nice, I guess, like holographic effect. It's just something I kind of do automatically for like easy materials that look impressive. I don't think it really comes across in this scene, as you'll see later, but it's there. It's just another thing that I like to do. I don't know what else is really left to show on this model. As you can see, I really kept things simple. I feel like I know my way around the node editor pretty well now. Watch a lot of tutorials, take a lot of tips from them, and I just want to kind of like collate all of that into one video. I will, of course, provide links to the tutorials that I learned from, and we'll make another video that goes more into the scene at large.